Welcome to the No More Wasted Days podcast. I'm Sara, and I'm so excited for today's episode. I had the pleasure of interviewing Kyle. Kyle is nearly 7 months alcohol free, and his journey all started with the idea to take on the 30-day alcohol free challenge. Along with doing the 30-day alcohol free challenge, Kyle is also a member of the Daymakers. I loved hearing Kyle's story, and he is so authentic about the fact that in the beginning of his journey, he was using the 30-day alcohol free challenge to take a break from alcohol so he could prove to himself that he didn't have a problem. I really resonated with this because that was a lot how I was in the beginning of my journey. I hope you find this interview as inspiring as I did. Can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your life before the 30-day alcohol-free challenge, and then a little bit into your alcohol-free journey too? Just touch on that just a titch.
Sure, absolutely. My name is Kyle. I am 40 years old. I live in Texas. I've been in Texas my whole life, and I've got a wife of 16 years and a 6-year-old son who's very energetic and keeps me on my toes. I grew up right in the heart of the Bible Belt. For anyone unfamiliar with that culture, especially like throughout the 90s, it really kind of stemmed from the whole like moral majority movement in like the late 70s and early 80s, where the emphasis was you're a sinner, you're inherently a bad person, and you have to work on that to become better, rather than trying to focus on what Christianity or religion or a relationship with whatever creator is. It focused on behavioral control, and that like the worst things you could do were have sex, drink or do drugs, or be gay. And that's what I was completely inundated with. And for me, I'm somewhat neurodivergent, and I'm a pretty emotional and pensive person. And so all of that with my personality kind of coalesced to this sort of self-loathing feeling that was really difficult for me to know how to deal with as an adolescent, and really carried through towards my like adult, years that I'm still sort of learning how to deal with. As far as like how I grew up, my parents were they're still married. They've got a great relationship. It was a fantastic childhood. No huge at-home worries or anything like that for the most part. But a lot of the negative stuff came from school and came from church, because all of that was really integrated. When I was between the ages of, I guess, maybe 5 and 7, my mom got diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with that, it was a relatively new thing that came out at that time. And her symptoms were basically this like intense joint pain, massive fatigue throughout most days, and insomnia. So she did pretty much everything she could from a parenting standpoint, but a lot of it really had to fall on my dad just by nature of the illness. And so I saw him, step up, kind of push his own needs aside and do what he needed to do to take care of the family. And all of that, along with the self-loathing that was in there, it sort of created this sense and this idealism in my head of that's who I should be. I need to put my own needs aside, understand that I have to work really, really hard to be a good person. And so when you push all that stuff down and you aren't taught how to deal with emotions and deal on how to accept yourself, you're going to find something to make that easier for you. And so I went to a small private school that was religious based, and there was a partying like contingent of the school, but it wasn't like the mainstream. It was pretty easy to stay away from. And so I didn't really party much at all in high school. I didn't drink. Honestly, I didn't really drink substantially until I was 22. Never did drugs, all that stuff. I was a pretty straight-laced kid for the most part. Very artistic. I was in theater, did music, sports, all that stuff. So I had outlets. But it was still, I still didn't know how to manage myself very well. And so I graduated, went to Texas Christian University, majored in social work, actually, because I really wanted to help people. I wanted to be a therapist or something. And so that all of the things that I sort of grew up with, the strong religious belief, all of those, tendencies and thought patterns that I grew up with followed me all throughout college. And I joined a Christian fraternity, was an officer in it, and officers could not drink. And so I didn't get out of that officer position until I was 22. And that's when I really had my first drink substantially. So I kind of delayed my rite of passage, as it were, drinking until pretty far beyond when people usually do that. I still remember that night we went to like a formal, we came back and it was me and my friends. I think I had a few shots and a couple of beers. And I remember after having had those, I remember thinking to myself, this feels amazing. My brain is no longer like racing. I don't have these thoughts and these worries and these fears. I'm just calm. And I remember thinking at the time, this probably isn't good that I feel this way. But I didn't, my thoughts about like someone who has a problem with alcohol, I think this is an issue that a lot of people have, but my thoughts were alcoholics are drunk all the time and they can't hold a job. They don't have, all those little things
Yeah.
that I think you tick off in your head, DUI, all that stuff. And so I paid attention more to the outward signs of whether or not this was a problem rather than what it was doing to me internally and how I was behaving. So the red flags that I knew of to look out for were very extreme.
Yeah.
It didn't hit me hard at first. I wasn't drinking all the time. It was something I did every once in a while, and it was usually a beer or two. It started off kind of slow, but I think it does for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah.
Alcohol's very insidious. You don't realize that you're relying on it until you've already been relying on it for a long time.
Yeah.
So after graduation, I went to graduate school and like the real world started and everything. I got my first job, like career like job, and all of that stress and struggling to find my identity still while dealing with things that I hadn't dealt with my entire life were there. I got engaged at the time to my wife and I met right before we graduated. And, planning for my future, all of that was just tough. And slowly the drinking escalated. I can't really pinpoint when it happened. It just happened. I
That's how it
woke up
is,
one
isn't it?
Yeah, I just woke up one day and I was like, "Man, I'm downing a bottle of wine. This is not what it used to be." I do remember one time I had a really bad day at work and I came home and on my way home, I was thinking, I'm going to get absolutely shit faced. And I did. And obviously felt terrible the next morning and all that stuff. And I kind of made a pact with myself. Well, I'm not going to do that again. If I'm having a stressful day, that's not what I'm going to turn to. But again, you can turn to alcohol without consciously turning to alcohol. You're not saying to yourself, I had a bad day, so I'm doing this. You just created this habit and you don't necessarily identify why you're doing it, but you're doing it. And all of that happened, and that's kind of what I've learned through a lot of this is that you have to shine a light on those behaviors and have a good objective view of why you're doing what you're doing in order to truly move forward and improve yourself. And so my consumption, my habits slowly grew to an everyday thing. It was nights, it was weekends. I never drank at work. I never showed up to work drunk or anything like that. That was one of those, you know, big red flags that I never wanted to cross. And so I didn't, thankfully. Didn't have any of those really. My relationship with my wife was great. I still was in good physical shape. I, was able to keep my job, no DUIs, anything like that. But what slowly started happening is my depression and my anxiety that came from years and years of all the things I talked about became completely unmanageable. I mean, in the past like 5 years, when things started getting really bad, about the time my son was born and more stress was added,
Yeah.
that's when I sort of noticed that there were days that were just, I couldn't function and I couldn't figure out why. I would sit there, I would have a panic attack, or my mind would race and I would have a major depressive episode. I would have to pace around and hyperventilate. There were times that I would just start crying uncontrollably for no reason. Um, and had to take off of work because of these mental issues. I kept, I guess, fooling myself that I had some other issue, that the problem was anxiety and depression. I need medication. And that's true. But alcohol, I mean, that's like throwing gasoline on a fire.
Yeah. It's
That's
not
sort of,
doing you any favors.
I mean, it'll for an hour or maybe an evening, it'll take those away. But the problem is all you're doing is like you're damming the river. And then the next day it's tenfold worse. And I got into that cycle. And that's not why I initially started the no more wasted days 30-day thing. I started that because for one of my annual checkups, I had some moderately elevated liver enzymes, nothing really concerning, but enough that in my head, I was thinking, ah, damn it. Okay. This is probably catching up with me.
Mhm.
I need to, and I'm a dad now. And so I need to get this under control. And that was ostensibly why I did it. But looking back and looking at how I approached it, what I was really looking for was validation that I didn't have a problem.
Oh, I
So,
totally understand that because that
yeah,
was my thing. I was like, if I can quit for 30 days, I can prove I don't have a problem to myself. Nobody was
I
questioning my drinking but me. And I was in that same like everything you say with the slow escalation, everything from the outside looked fine. And it was the whole like I had the perfect life and I still kind of feel like I do. It's different now. But it's like because I didn't have a DUI, because I hadn't lost my job, because my husband wasn't saying, "Hey, if this keeps going, this isn't gonna work for us." Those things weren't happening, so I was like, "This isn't a problem." And and I really when you say I did it to prove I didn't have a problem, oh, that is so why I did it. And then I kind of found out differently along the way.
yeah.
But what were your biggest concerns or challenges before you took on quitting drinking?
I mean, biggest concerns were health.
Yeah.
I was just worried I was going to be, that it was turning me into a bad husband or a bad father, or that my biggest worry was always that I was going to end up with some kind of liver disease and I would have the knowledge that I put myself there and the guilt and the shame that that would come with was really what I wanted to avoid. That was the worst, I think, thought. And so I kept thinking if I can just take a break, get back to baseline, then things will even out and I can do this again and I'll be okay.
Yeah. And
Uh,
almost using it as a tool to it's like the 30-day challenge was like a check for you.
mhm,
Like, if I can do this, then and I know that's what a lot of people do, and sometimes they find out differently and they keep going, and sometimes they're like, "Okay, I did 30 days, great, I'm gonna go back," and they find out that didn't work out so great either. But in your 30 days, can you remind me on your first 30-day challenge, did you get the 30 days? Because I do know that it took a few starts
yeah.
and stops.
So I never got to a full 30 days until I decided to quit for good.
Yeah, you finally made that and that was pretty
Yeah.
recently, right?
I'll be at 7 months in another
Wow,
week,
that's
I
so
think.
awesome.
Yeah, it feels really good. Got a little like necklace that like reminds me of it and
I love that.
silly stuff like that.
No, I think that stuff is so important. It really
Yeah.
is. But
I
in
like during the day I'll just kind of rub it a little bit and just be like, oh,
yeah.
I'm good.
And just know, "Oh, I like that a lot." And then with your experiences within the 30-day challenge in the beginning, did you notice some changes that were positive that made you think, "Maybe I should keep going?" Or I'm curious about, like, what took you to the, "Okay, I'm gonna do this amount of time, then I'm gonna try drinking again, then I'm gonna go to this amount of time." What was
Yeah.
that like?
I noticed some positive things pretty immediately. I was able to sleep really well, which
Me too.
was very fortunate because a lot of people say they have trouble sleeping
Mhm.
when they cut it off, but that wasn't my experience, and I'm really grateful for it. Mentally, I felt better. I wasn't perfect. I still had, anxiety and depressive issues, but it was never to a point that I felt like I should be in a mental hospital, which
Yeah.
I did have a few times. Think what happened was the first time, and this is before I joined No More Wasted Days, but the first time I decided I was going to do 30 days on my own, I made it 7 days. And I think I bargained with myself after that, that like I'll save it for the weekend and that sort of thing. And that lasted maybe a good 3 weeks. And then I came back to it because those fears were still there. So a friend of mine turned me on to No More Wasted Days. And I was like, all right, this January, I'm going to try it again. And I made it like 22 or 24 days, something
Hmm.
along those lines. And when I got to that point, in my mind, my goal had kind of been reached because my goal wasn't necessarily 30 days. I mean, said it was, but it was really to go a decent time without it, prove that I was okay, and then do what I want to do. What I always said was I was going to do that and then evaluate whether or not I wanted to drink going forward. But the truth is, I had already decided I was going to. This was just an excuse for me to fool myself that I didn't have a long term issue that needed to be addressed. And so I kept active in the No More Wasted Days chat, and I would do 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off pretty consistently throughout the rest of the year. And I noticed the yo-yoing of that was it made things worse.
Hmm.
All the mental issues that I was dealing with, when they came back worse every time.
Yeah.
And I'm in my job, I'm a CFO of a city in North Texas. And so all the decisions I make are data driven. And with that mindset, I couldn't deny the data that I had that look, maybe I do have underlying mental issues, but it gets worse every time you drink alcohol. That's not a coincidence. And so I kept kind of doing that yo-yo. Last January, my wife and I were both going to do 30 days, and I didn't make 30 days. She did, but I didn't. I don't remember how long I had. I kind of did the same yo-yo I think I usually did because my mindset really hadn't changed. And I can't really pinpoint when this shifted, but I just, enough was enough, I think.
Yeah.
I think I'd had so long and so many downward cycles of horrible mental like anguish. I mean, I don't even have words to describe how painful that was mentally, the self-loathing. I mean, sometimes passively suicidal thoughts that would come through, and I just couldn't ignore it anymore. Being a dad, I kept thinking, well, what if my son goes through the same thing? Do I want to be able to shepherd him through that and help him? And so getting to back to that like sense of duty and selflessness that I really got from when I was a kid, just something in me snapped. It was about a week or 2 weeks after my 40th birthday. I had a big bottle of vodka in the fridge, came home from work on a Tuesday, had a little bit of it, dumped the rest out. And I had it because I was having an anxiety problem. And I texted my friend in Alcoholics Anonymous and just said, I want to go to a meeting.
Hmm.
And my wife knew something was up because I was shaky, well, not physically shaky, but emotionally shaky. And,
Yeah.
again, on the verge of like just breaking down. And I told her I was going to go to AA, and she was completely supportive. God, I love my wife. She's amazing. My friend who lives not quite an hour away found a meeting for me, was there for me the next night. I mean, I was, from the time I texted him to the time I went to my first meeting was less than 24 hours.
Yeah.
Everything was there. And I was terrified to go in there because I didn't want the stigma. I didn't want all that stuff. And everyone pretty much in that meeting was great. They just sat there and had a conversation with me. There were like 30 people. And they talked to me, and their story was all very similar. And it
Mhm.
wasn't always just those huge red flags that we talked about. A lot of it was
Yeah.
the same stuff I had gone through. And so I just couldn't deny it anymore. And I had had enough and said, I'm for sure done. And I haven't looked back. That was it.
And so for you, it was this journey of first, okay, I'm going to try to do this on my own, but then with the help from the 30-day challenge, use some of those tools, put them in place, but your mind just wasn't fully committing to it yet.
Exactly.
And then it just took those, we don't like to say failures, but it's like took those data points, as one of
Yeah.
our members
It's a
always
nice way to put
says. Yeah. And started going, okay, I'm collecting the data and saying, okay, it's really not working, but then how do I do it? And what I do love is that you started within the Daymakers community, you've always been really active. And when you were telling your journey, I was like, "Oh, I remember that, and I remember that."
Mhm.
And it's always from the outside looking in, I always wanna go, "Just quit. It will be so much easier." But
Sure.
for someone like me to say it, it's you're thinking, "Oh, well, your story's not the same as mine. Your journey's not the same." And then it kinda turns out, no, we're also very similar, and it's something we talk about a lot too, like, we're all pretty similar on this, and it does turn out, okay, I can hear that from other people, and I love that then you reached out for AA too, just
Mhm.
because I think people think I'm the anti-AA person, and I'm really not. I mention it a lot in our Daymakers calls, and I say,
Yeah.
"You should go do it, get an in-person meeting because online is great." I just think so for you, it was just like that 30-day challenge was just that first little jumping off point, like dipping your toe in
Mhm.
to finally getting to your ending story, but not really.
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's a process.
It was the first time I considered making a change. I had
Yeah.
always wanted it just to work out, and it wasn't, and so when I joined it, I was and I knew there was, like, Quit Lit out there. I
Mhm.
was scared even to buy a book. I think because I didn't want confirmation of this being an issue, or I thought just the act of doing that means it's an issue, and I just wanted to turn a blind eye to it. So it was all I mean, it happened as it should have, that in the way that I usually am is I don't go whole hog into something. I always have to kind of wade into it. And that's what this was. It just happened to be that from the point that I started to the point that I quit, I saw such an escalation in the negative effects of things that it was absolutely undeniable. I mean, the writing was on the wall. Stop, stop drinking. No, you don't have all those red flags that you think were the only things that cause a problem, but you have all these other things.
Yeah. And I
And
think that's so important to not to start identifying the small red flags and seeing that they are actually indeed red flags. We just choose to ignore them because they're not what we see on TV, or it's not really
Mhm.
TV anymore these days, but I just feel like you watch shows, you hear stories, and it's always this, "I lost my job, I lost my family," and
Yeah.
that's when I knew, and I was waiting for that. Were you, like, waiting for that big red flag, like, the big moment? Because I really was. I was like, "I'm not gonna quit until something really bad happens."
I think in my head, I wasn't, but for a long time, that's the only thing that would have taken me quitting.
Yeah.
Because I always thought, well, I'm going to get a hold of this before I have a major physical problem or I get a DUI or whatever. Because that was never my goal. I wasn't waiting for it. But for a long time, that's what it would have taken. I'm grateful that it didn't take that.
Yeah, that's how I always feel too. I'm like, "I'm so glad I finally decided to just take a chance on myself and say,
Yeah.
"Okay, just prove you can do it." I was so that person. I'm just gonna prove I can do it. So if anybody
Mhm.
ever questions my drinking, I can say, "I can stop anytime. I did 30 days one time." And then it's the going back if you choose to and figuring that out. So now you're 7 months alcohol free, and how
Almost. But yeah.
almost. How has your life changed since you really shut the
Um,
door on it?
oh man, I mean, it's changed a bunch in a lot of different ways. I think just to sum it all up, I would say that I'm just overall, I'm more manageable for myself. I guess it's hard to really like pinpoint like, oh, this is, I am sleeping better. I'm more mentally clear. I'm more present, all that stuff. I'm not as lethargic and that's all there. But the biggest reasons that I quit were all mental and were all these huge issues. And what's happened is by getting alcohol out of the way, I could actually figure out what my baseline was and what I needed to properly address. So went to a psychiatrist, got on the right medication. I'm in therapy with a good therapist and we've identified these negative thought patterns. I mean, I'm just setting my life up for the full extent of what I could be because I no longer am using this huge thing to solve all of these issues. And then that huge thing becomes its own problem. And so it's just shoving that out of the way and then watching who I grow into. And I don't know how else to to say that as profound as it feels, but that's truly what's happening is that it's just I'm fully myself now.
Mhm.
And that's the best way I can describe it.
Yeah.
It's not
No, I
always
think that's perfect.
yeah, it's not always easy, and I still have issues, but I know what to do to address those issues, and I'm not my solution isn't a problem anymore.
Right? Oh my
Yeah.
gosh, that's perfectly worded. My solution isn't a problem anymore. What keeps you going from day to day to make the choice to be alcohol free?
Well, several things. I mean, first of all, I'm to the point I honestly don't really miss the effect it had on me. There are times I miss it, and it's mostly, I miss sharing a bottle of wine with my wife on a night out. I do miss that. That's the biggest thing, but it's a pretty mild inconvenience. It's not a big deal. But I don't miss being impaired. I've been impaired for so much of my life. Even when things are hard and I'm really stressed out, I just don't miss it. And I'm really grateful for that because I know there are a lot of people that that's not the story. But I've also done a lot of, I mentioned not wanting to read Quit Lit for a long time. Since then, I've read like 90% of the Quit Lit books out there.
You're like, now
And they're
you're a
great.
Quitlet junkie. No.
Yeah. And they're great. And sometimes I like ones that are more story driven.
Yeah.
I think Lauren McCown has some really good ones. But I also read, I don't remember the author's name. I think it's Glenn something, but he said Alcohol Lied to Me is what the book is.
Oh, okay. I know that one.
Yeah. And it's about like the physical things that alcohol did to you. But, on top of that, I've listened to a lot of podcasts and Sober Powered.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorites. Jill is a biologist and she talks about the physical things. And so I've done a lot of research into that. And anytime I think, well, maybe I can have one, maybe I can moderate, I come back to what I know about myself, what's empirical.
Yeah.
And what I've come to, and I'll try and make this brief, but I was terrified of being an alcoholic. I was terrified of the label. I was terrified of what it meant. And I still hate that term because it's so loaded and it boxes people in. What I say about myself, whenever I do go to AA, I probably go once every couple of weeks. I'll say, yeah, Kyle, alcoholic, because that's what they say, but it's really dated. What I've come to realize is that I've developed over time alcohol use disorder. Basically, my body, my brain has had enough of that chemical, enough ethanol, that whenever, no matter how small of a dose I have, it routes in my brain to where the pleasure center is so those endorphins are so powerful that it's inevitable that I would have another and another and another. And then I truly treat it as a medical condition because I believe that it is. And so it's kind of similar to being a diabetic. It's your responsibility to acknowledge what your body does with that substance without you wanting it to, just what it does and what you have to do to stay healthy and happy. And in my case, not end up in a psych ward somewhere. And so, the few times that I don't really get tempted anymore, but the times that thought enters my head, that's what I always go back to is, yeah, but even though you have a short memory, like you remember what
Yeah.
that was like.
Right.
And this is a small price to pay for sanity and for the life that you want.
Oh, yeah.
And so far that has worked. I do still go back to AA every couple of weeks. It's not a huge part of my journey now. It was to sort of kickstart things, but I really go back just to be in that environment, hear from people. And I'm fortunate that the group that I'm involved in is very supportive and good. And that's not always the case with that organization, but this one's
Well,
good.
it's like anything, finding your group of people,
Yeah.
and even in an online community, you might join and go, "These aren't my people," and
Yeah.
so nicely unsubscribe from that and try out a different thing. And I love that you mentioned Jill from Sober Powered because I've messaged her before and said, "I love that you just say, 'No, you can't moderate.'" And
Hmm.
she's like, "You just can't." I'm
Yeah.
like, I feel like sometimes I'm a little too nice about it, and I'm like, "Well, try it out and see what happens." And I always wanna be
Get
like,
some more data.
It's not gonna work," but
Yeah. But
I
what
never
works.
like to just tell people like, because everybody is different, and especially everybody that comes in and does the 30-day challenge.
Mhm.
I think the Daymakers is a little more unique because I really do think that's a group of people who are on the same mission to remove alcohol from their life. And
Yeah, very quickly I realized that when I was in that group.
and you
But
were like, "Hey, now that's I don't know if that's what I wanted to do yet."
yeah, I was like, "I'm not sure I signed on for that, but you guys are nice, so I'll stick around for a bit." Yeah, I think that's really crucial is when you're dealing with this, understand it for what it is, that it's not entirely a behavioral
Yeah.
thing. It's certainly not a moral thing.
Mhm.
It's my saving grace is to understand this is a medical thing for me.
Yeah.
It's the way my brain is. I can't change it.
Yeah.
You know, I could go a year or 2 years without it, and I bet you that if I were to start drinking again after that, within a couple of weeks or a few months, I'd be right back to where I was. Because this is what Jill mentioned in one of her podcasts, and I have this saved on my phone because it was so eye opening. She was like, once you turn that corner, once your brain, your synapses have developed like that, you don't really undo it. You know, your brain will heal in all sorts of other ways, but that chemical will always do what the extent of what it was doing before.
They say it's like a it just becomes dormant, almost like a
Mhm.
dormant volcano that can still erupt at any point. And so
Yeah.
once the substance is re-entered, and I found that really interesting. And like you, I didn't want to be called an alcoholic.
Mhm.
And finally now when people will say, "Oh, you're an alcoholic," I'm just like, "Yeah." I and I feel like now I was so afraid of the word, but I think more of us just need to claim it because it shows people like us who are super afraid. They can go, "Oh, that's Kyle, and he's really successful in his job, and he's saying, 'I'm Kyle, and I'm an alcoholic,' and that's Sarah, and she's doing all these things, and she
Yeah.
says she's an alcoholic." I definitely don't I still don't love the word, and I still think it's outdated at this point, and I prefer AUD, alcohol use disorder, but I think it took me 2 years to finally be okay with that and say, "Well, yeah, the data's there, Sarah, you probably are," and I'm like, "Oh, okay." And that's
Yeah.
years of being alcohol free and knowing I couldn't go back to it and I couldn't be a quote unquote normal drinker.
Mhm.
So, but I do think there's a lot of power in just knowing it's an addictive substance. And
Meant to be that way.
yeah,
Yeah.
for everyone. And there's nothing wrong with you if you become addicted to it because that's its job.
Yeah. The good news is I mean, there's such a sober movement now that
Oh, yeah.
it's not as scary as it used to be,
Yeah.
like, with something. I still hate the term alcoholic. The only time I say it is when I'm in AA and I kinda have to, otherwise people raise their eyebrows at me.
If
But,
you
I
choose a
mean,
different word.
yeah, yeah. But, like I said, if someone were to ask me, I'd probably be like, "I don't drink because of the effect it has on me mentally. I just don't like to do it." And
Yeah.
I'd leave it at that. But if someone were to ask me point blank, "Are you an alcoholic?" I'd probably say yes, and then kind of explain a little bit more about it.
Yeah.
Well, you
And I
can
think
either,
that's an
as a culture, we can either reclaim that word or we can completely shun it. And then right now, I'm still kind of in the shunning mode. But maybe in another year, a few months, I'll be like, yeah, I'm fine with it.
Yeah, it's still not my favorite, and it took me a while to claim sober. Like, that was a hard one even for me to claim, and then now I'm just like, "Oh, I would just love to have shirts that shout it to the world," and I'm
Yeah.
like, it's funny the change you take. So, if you could offer any advice, if there's someone on the fence about trying the 30-day alcohol-free challenge, what would you tell them?
Well, I'd say if you've even thought about doing it, you should do it. If you've come across this and you've decided this may be a good thing for me, there's some part of you that knows that you should. And I think that that person should listen to that.
Yeah,
And also be very open and honest and real with yourself about why you are where you are. I started, and I talked about this a little bit, but I started it as a tool to basically keep me drinking, to prove it wasn't an issue. And so if I were to write that on paper, I would say, yes, I want a better life, but it can't touch alcohol. Alcohol has to stay. And that's absurd. If you want a better life, you have to objectively evaluate everything that you're doing on a consistent basis. Don't take being sober completely off the table. Really look at it. And I remember all these people would say, "Oh, do it. It's so worth it. Your life is 100 times better." And I don't know if I just wouldn't allow myself to think about it, but I kept was like, yeah, no, that's great, but no. And now I'm one of those same people that are like, this is honestly so much better in every way, to the point where even on my worst days, it's not enough for me to ever want to pick that up again. So, I mean, I would say if you're on the fence, do a lot of research into what alcohol is and what it does, and really dive into the community,
Yeah.
because that's what this isn't just about quitting drinking. It's about evaluating the place this has taken in your life and trying to make the fullest, best life for yourself you can. And that's a holistic thing. If it were just about putting down alcohol, then you would white knuckle through it and be miserable. But it's truly about trying to develop your life and the best that you can be,
Yeah.
and the happiest you.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed hearing your story. I know I've gotten to chat with you on Daymakers calls, but I haven't heard all of your background. So that was really interesting for me. And
Yeah, I'm
I
sorry.
am beyond excited for you that it's finally clicked. It finally stuck. And I always know for my day makers that are in there doing the work and I see them, collecting their data points and coming back. I always know it's going to click because the people that are in there showing up, doing the work, even if they're saying, but I just want to learn how to drink normally, that light bulb will finally go off that says, oh, it's actually just easier if I stop. And I'm so happy that it's happened for you.
And it helps to know that like there's so many people that ride that roller coaster and just don't talk about it.
Yeah.
The word normal drinker is there's really not a normal.
Yep.
It's not a substance that's built to have anyone be a normal drinker. So,
Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth there. But again, thank you so much for doing this. And
hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
thank you so much for joining this podcast episode today. If after hearing Kyle's story, you're inspired to join either the 30-day alcohol-free challenge or the Daymakers, both of the links are below in the show notes of this episode. And as always, please take a moment to give the No More Wasted Days podcast a rating if you haven't already. This really helps our podcast get into more listeners' ears. Thank you so much, and I'll be in your ear in the next episode.